Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much for joining us today. Jazakallah khair, Sarah, for that beautiful, appreciate that. One, one. I'm getting a feedback. Sarah very kindly pointed out, the majority of my work that I do at Khalil Center now is predominantly relationships. So either marital or premarital counseling or even individual counseling with adults, but largely focused on relationships and marriage. So I was really excited to have the opportunity today to talk to you about marriage as an opportunity for self-development, particularly in light of the current global pandemic that we're experiencing, as well as in preparation for Ramadan, and inshallah combining both as a way of increasing our spirituality and becoming closer to our deen and raising our iman, while also being extremely mindful of how different this Ramadan will be, not only for us individually, but as well for our relationship, for our marriage, for our family. Next slide. So a few things that I want to just start out with. These are things that I have been discussing with most of my clients, the marital clients particularly that I have right now, is that our relationships currently are under strain. The best of us with the current conditions are still stressed out. There's no way that the global anxiety, and literally global anxiety, isn't affecting everyone. It might affect people in different ways. We all know that as every human being, Allah SWT created us very differently. Every human being has different coping skills, has different strategies that we utilize. But everyone's affected in some way, adults, children, everyone. So when it comes to marriages, some things to keep in mind, particularly as most of us are spending a lot more time home than usual, is if you and your spouse are both working from home, there really need to be designated spaces for work. Some of the couples I work with talked about how they're both camped out on the dining table, in the living area, that kind of thing. That's fine, possibly for like working at home, every now and then, or possibly on a weekend. But 5 days a week, every single day, is going to make a strain on the relationship. So having designated spaces, separate spaces where people are assigned, and that's your area. And then just being honest with one another and being clear about what timings are you available to have a knock on the door or to get a text, to take care of something, do a quick favor, grab something. And if you're not available, be clear about that too. Because if you give the impression that you are, and then your spouse reaches out and you can't, it's going to cause friction. Again, remember, everyone is affected. Men and women process differently, but all human beings process differently. So because your spouse doesn't look affected or act affected the way you do, doesn't mean that they're not. Everyone is. This is a time where we really need to adjust expectations. Very similarly to what Dr. Human mentioned earlier about making sure that, for example, I think he said if you don't have a habit of reading 10 juz daily, this isn't the time to start something and expect that you'll be able to do it. Similarly, have reasonable expectations for yourself and your spouse. Even though maybe you can tackle bigger projects when you're both home, it used to be on days off or weekends. Doing those types of things while you have a full-time work schedule going, home responsibilities, possibly kids to take care of, is not practical. Dividing roles and responsibilities is another aspect of relationships in the pandemic that have been very significant for many of the couples I work with. What I mean by that is most of us understand or have some understanding of what our personal roles and responsibilities are in the marriage, as well as our spouses during normal day-to-day life. Currently, lots of those rules are out the window. It's different when you think about who's going to do the dishes or who's going to sweep the floor when you're having one, maybe two meals at home. Now we're having three. It's different when you think about who's usually responsible for helping kids with homework when one of you gets home at 5 o'clock and one of you gets home at 7. Now both of you are home all day. So looking at how our schedules are adjusting, as well as what each person's strengths and weaknesses are is very important. A lot of couples do well dividing stuff down the middle. Half of the time one person does it, half of the time the other person does it. And if that works for you, that's great. But many couples really need to play to each other's strengths and weaknesses. If one person is better at a certain thing that's extra challenging for someone else, that's not necessarily a fair division of labor. Not that there shouldn't be some conversation about how to divide it, but right down the middle doesn't work for everyone. you're going to have some adjustment at this time and be reasonable about those adjustments. There is significantly more responsibility on most of us, even for the people who are not working from home. Those of you who are out there considered as essential workers, particularly people who are interacting with the public, there's an extra level of stress on you when you know that you have to do your job every day and also risk daily potentially being infected, having to be extra careful about your personal protective equipment, masks, and those types of things, washing your hands. And many people, especially healthcare workers, but also I've spoken to people who work in like grocery stores and other avenues that interact with the public, who are very, very concerned about bringing home germs and potentially infecting their own family with the virus. That's another level of stress that you didn't have in your daily life before. So even though you're technically, your hours may not look different, that you leave for work at the same time and come home close to the same time, the level of responsibility on you and stress on you is very likely significantly different. And essentially what that means is you might not be able to keep up the same responsibilities you did before. So we also have to be reasonable about what things have to happen every day, have to happen every week, have to happen on a regular basis, that kind of thing. That's what I mean when I say be clear about limits. Husbands and wives need to be honest with one another. You may not know it right from the beginning, but when you realize that you're hitting a limit, that you're trying to take something on that you're not good at, not capable of, that's overwhelming you, that's stressing you out, you need to be honest with your spouse. We need to remember that our spouse is not a mind reader. This is something that I work with a lot in the relationships that I help, is the idea that we've been married for 5 years, he should know this by now. She's known me for so long, why doesn't she know this about me? At the end of the day, we owe our spouse the benefit of the doubt that if they did truly understand and know this, we wouldn't be having these concerns. So we can't expect our spouse to be a mind reader. Be clear about what your limits are. Conversely, making an agreement or making a commitment to do something can't always be honored if we start it and figure out that it's not working. So be reasonable in that we may have to be flexible and be willing to adjust what responsibilities we agree to take on. You might think, yes, sure, I can do homework every evening because you always have. That's very different from doing the online work with the kids, for several hours during the day. That looks different, that feels different. It's a completely different amount of responsibility. It's not the same as helping them wrap up the homework that they have in the evenings. So it may not be able to be something that you can stick to, even though you had agreed to in the beginning. Slide. In the Quran, it says, be a garment to your spouse, that you and your spouse are both a garment to each other. What does this actually mean? What does a garment do? When I meet with a new couple for an intake in the beginning of a therapy session, I often go over this verse with them and ask them what their understanding is of this verse. It's a beautiful verse that we often see on wedding invitations, and a lot of people are familiar with it, but not everyone has given thought to what does it actually mean. So the garment that you have on, the shirt that you're wearing right now, what's it literally doing for you? We know that it's supposed to cover you. If it's raining or windy, it's supposed to protect you, shield you from the elements. If you have a big scar, whatever garments you wear are supposed to hide your flaws. They're also supposed to guard your modesty, and a nice garment is going to beautify you. These are the responsibilities of a spouse. So what does that actually look like? Cover your spouse, protect, shield from elements, hide their flaws, guard your spouse's modesty, and beautify them are actual acts that we can do every single day. The Quran doesn't say you are a garment to your spouse the day your spouse deserves it, the day your spouse is behaving with you, the day your spouse is a garment to you. It's a declarative sentence that you are a garment to your spouse, meaning you do this whether or not they're doing what they're supposed to do. Couples often struggle with this idea that I was trying to give benefit of the doubt, but my spouse didn't give it. I'm not saying that's okay. You both owe this to each other. However, as human beings, all of us are flawed, and all of us have good days and bad days. And like I said earlier, this pandemic situation is affecting people differently. There may be times where you're able to protect your spouse in a way that, while they should also protect you, currently they're not able to. But that doesn't mean that they can't do other things for you. We may not always be able to do all of the things that a garment is supposed to do all the time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not expect us to be perfect. There is no call on us to be perfect all the time. We are human beings, and it's okay to mess up. It's okay to make mistakes. but our goal is supposed to be to strive to be the best we can be, inshallah. So why am I talking about being a garment to your spouse? When we're talking about marriage as an opportunity for self-development, we have to make sure that we are not only focusing on what we can be doing for our spouse, but also what we can be doing for ourselves. Next slide, please. Being a mindful garment in this situation means knowing how your spouse is affected by the current situation. That can only happen with conversation. That can only happen by discussing it, talking about it. A lot of people are being very careful these days to try to limit how much you're hearing and seeing on the news. And if you're not already doing that, I do recommend it. It can be overwhelming. It can be very overwhelming. And even for myself personally, it has been overwhelming. So even I've limited how much I'm reading about it, the WhatsApp forwards, deleting them or not looking at them, and how much I'm letting myself hear news that somebody else is watching, or letting a video play with current numbers and what does the curve look like and how many people have died. It's a lot. Sometimes we don't want to do more and keep talking about it besides having seen all this or read all this. But having conversations, maybe not daily, but on a regular basis where you're discussing how you're being affected by this, how you feel about it, what each other's concerns are, is going to be one way to be a mindful garment to your spouse. There have been family changes for everyone. Whether or not you have kids, you may not any longer be able to go out as often as you did. Or ideally, probably, I hope inshallah, not going out at all, in the sense of like recreational stuff. So in the past, couples who often spent time together by eating out at restaurants or, going to different events, going to lectures, going to movies, things like that, visiting friends and family, all of that is out. Right now, we're giving a lot more time to one another, but not necessarily because we want to, because we have no choice to, which also means that we have to be mindful of that time we spend together. But especially for people who do have kids of any age, that's going to have an even more increased change on the family life. Most families kind of are centered largely around kids' activities, schooling, events, sports, things like that. All of that is out right now. Many people aren't able to visit family, visit their parents, visit their relatives, visit their neighbors. That's going to have an effect on you. Not seeing people that you love, not being able to spend time with people you care about is going to impact you, even though you are able to understand that it's the right thing to do, it's the safe thing to do, doesn't mean it's going to feel good. Doesn't mean you're going to be okay with that. Many of us have financial concerns right now. This situation has caused a lot of us to have dramatically changed our income, because if you work in a place that's closed right now and there's no income generated, then you very likely aren't getting paid. Many people own businesses or are self-employed and are not able to pursue that business right now. Even people with what used to be considered very secure type of jobs, whether it was healthcare or information technology, business, finance jobs, not necessarily self-employed or hourly, but even those positions are being affected by this and impacted, and furloughs are happening, people are getting laid off. So it's going to, again, change the dynamics of your home and your lifestyle if you're having financial concerns, not to mention the increased anxiety and stress this causes. That is coupled with the fact that we currently have limited means for stress management. Most of us used to work on our stress by going to the gym, spending time with people, recreational activities, doing things that were relaxing and fun, many of which are no longer an option. So the increased anxiety that we're dealing with still needs to be dealt with and still needs to be handled. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, doing all this for many couples while managing kids and their schoolwork. I have heard from a lot of families, everything from the schools demanding hours of work each day or several hours of being logged into Zoom and other platforms, all the way to the opposite stress of having too little work that's scheduled and having their kids have several hours of open, unstructured time that the parents are trying to figure out what to do with them. Either way, it's very stressful. Either way, it impacts your ability to be okay, which is going to impact your relationship. Next slide, please. Ultimately, you can't pour from an empty cup. So what that means is if you aren't doing okay, you're not going to be able to be a good spouse, be a good parent, be a good partner to anyone else. Our first responsibility is to our own self-care and well-being. I've been speaking about this to several of my clients, and I hope inshallah by now this is information that many of you listening are familiar with, but I'm going to review it quickly anyway. Self-care means, are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you eating balanced meals? Are you getting exercise? Are you maintaining your hygiene? And are you managing stress? Some people during these types of situations, it's again, one extreme or the other. We're oversleeping, we're overeating, we're not exercising, we're not maintaining hygiene, and our stress is through the roof. Some people are trying so hard to manage their stress that, or they're so concerned with everything that's going on, they're not sleeping enough, they're not eating enough, they're over exercising or doing things that are risky by going outside unnecessarily, like to stores and doing errands that may not need to happen. Neither of those extremes are healthy. A healthy balance is 7 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep most nights, eating balanced meals, being mindful of how much you're snacking. Being at home and having access to your pantry and your kitchen isn't a good enough reason to be snacking several times throughout the day. The extra calories aren't just a physical effect on the body. They're going to be an emotional and mental effect as well. Not to mention, again, we're preparing for Ramadan. This is a good time to work on cutting back. That mindless kind of eating is a hard habit to break sometimes. Exercise is something that there's no prohibition against. All of us need to be mindful of this. Again, unfortunately, it's going to look different right now. So whereas before, it wasn't a big deal to go to the gym or to have a favorite like Zumba class that you attended or a kickboxing class or that kind of thing. Now, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to log into those things online. But there's a lot of gyms offering great exercise classes online, live ones even. And there's no prohibition on walking outside as long as you're able to maintain social distance from your neighbors and anyone you don't live with. Maintaining hygiene is extremely important. Whatever your hygiene routine was before the pandemic should be as close to possible to that now. What I mean is, if you used to take a shower every day, you should still be showering every day. Being at home, you don't need to dress up, but change your clothes every day. Make sure that you're taking care of yourself to the best of your ability because it lends you to feel good. It lends you to feel better. And all of this is going to help you manage your stress. Because again, if you're trying to be a good partner to your spouse, to be a good parent, to take care of your responsibilities at work, to take care of your home, to take care of anything that's important to you, you first have to be okay. Slide, please. In Ramadan, our relationships tend to be stressed in a slightly different way. So what I mean by that is maintaining spiritual growth on a personal level in your relationships and in your home for your family are all equally important. But previously, and again, as Brother Human also mentioned, we had different outlets for doing this. We also had different ways of doing this. Maintaining spiritual growth on a personal level usually is from your own fasting, from your own reading of Quran, praying salah, the dhikr that you do, the things that you do that help you feel connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that most of us try to make extra time for this holy month, that we try to accommodate within our responsibilities, whether at home or at work. But now we're doing this in a different dynamic. And Ramadan is also a great time to increase the spirituality and growth of a relationship, as well as even in your physical home, with children or without, but for your home to be a place of solace, to be a place that helps you feel connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, free of distractions, and helps you focus on improving your iman and connecting to your deen. This year's Ramadan is going to look and feel different. We need to be realistic about our disappointment and the longing that's expected for most of us to feel. Sometimes we feel like I shouldn't be disappointed because alhamdulillah I'm alive, or I shouldn't be disappointed because I have food to eat and there's so many people right now who don't. Those are absolutely true facts, and gratitude and being grateful for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings and mercy on you is a big part of being healthy and managing stress. Being aware of how blessed you are and what a privileged position you have compared to others helps us have perspective and helps us have realistic expectations of ourselves. But at the same time, we're human beings. And if you're disappointed, you're disappointed. If you feel longing for the things you're missing, the traditions, the family, the community feel, then you feel that longing. And it's not fair to tell yourself you can't. Worse, it's not fair to tell your spouse that they can't or that they shouldn't, or your kids. It's going to be a part of this Ramadan. Supporting one another through that is going to be much healthier for your relationships than shaming or lecturing or trying to tell each other to look at the bright side or be positive. Those things have their place and time. But when someone is particularly feeling sad that they can't spend the traditional weekend iftars at their parents' house the way they used to, or they're not having tarawih with their community the way they're used to, or having the iftar parties that they're used to having. Those are facts as well. And we need to be able to hear each other, which means we need to be able to speak about it, listen to what your partner is saying, and show empathy. You don't need to feel the same way to tell them that you're sorry that they're hurting. Even if you don't have that same perspective, it's appropriate and inshallah ta'ala helpful to your relationship to be able to empathize with your spouse and try to comfort them and support them. Those are things that we're going to all have to work on this year. This is going to be different again. And sometimes we had some of this. For example, if you or your spouse live far away from your family, then Ramadan was probably a common time that you felt some of that longing. But this year is going to be different because the traditions that we had made for our new home or for wherever we live, those can't even be tapped into for that extra level of support. Slide, please. So that means we're going to have to make new traditions. That means we're going to have to connect to this Ramadan with our spouse, with our family in a new way. That could include things like decorating your home. I often hear we don't have kids, so decorating is silly, or our kids are too little to understand. That may be true, but decorating your home is going to help you feel connected. This is just one suggestion. I'm not saying anybody needs to do this or that it's required or anything like that. But it's an example of a tradition that can help you feel connected to the month and physically in your own home and space remind you that this is a different time. Even though the pandemic is continuing, our working from home is continuing, that this is not like it was, for example, last week. This week is different. There's increased barakah in this month. There's increased ibadah in this month. And sometimes having decorations in your home can physically remind you of that aspect when emotionally or mentally you may not always be checked in. We can celebrate iftar even if it is just you and your spouse or you and your kids, your family. Sometimes I've heard a couple families talk about that there's like everyday kind of iftar food which for some people might be like opening your fast with a date and some water, maybe some fruit, and then eating dinner, which frankly is probably healthier than a lot of families' traditional iftar foods, which tend to be heavy, fried foods, greasy, things like that. But people sometimes save the quote unquote celebratory type iftars for the weekend or for when we have company over or for when we're going to an iftar party. You can celebrate iftar even if it's just you and your family. If you're trying to be health conscious and not eat, those fried foods, those heavier foods at all, that's totally fine. But if you're saving them for something or you and your family typically save them, then be conscious right now of saving them for a difficult fast, a day that was really difficult for you, your spouse, or one of your kids. That may be a day to have a celebratory iftar. When your children are fasting for the first time, if someone's keeping a full week without needing a break, especially for younger kids or teenagers even, that's a good enough reason for a celebration. Anything is a good enough reason for a celebration, alhamdulillah. So being mindful of those things to keep the feeling of Ramadan going. People are very connected to traditions. So feeling that familiar kind of, whether it's food or using specific kinds of plates or decorations or towels, whatever it is that your family does, kitchen towels, cushions, those are things that are going to remind you that this is a different time of the month. And that includes also new Tarawih traditions. If your family, the whole family used to get in the car after iftar and go to Tarawih, or even just the men used to go, now it's going to look different. So how is that going to be? Are we going to pray in Jama'at at home? Are we all praying at different times? What kind of emphasis are we giving to our Tarawih? Are we using time after iftar for rest, for dhikr? What is that going to look like? So talking about these things, planning these things can be something exciting and make it fun. Again, even if it's just the adults. And I keep stressing that because oftentimes when I'm talking to families about these things, I'm hearing a lot of, but we don't have kids or the kids are little. And while that's certainly true, and mashallah, there's a lot of benefit in doing these things for the sake of having your children feel celebration and experience Ramadan as a happy time, adults deserve that too. Adults deserve celebration. Adults deserve to feel happy. Adults also deserve to be able to enjoy this time right now. So inshallah, I hope you'll consider that. Next slide. A realistic part of relationships that I often encounter when I'm working with couples during Ramadan is that marital stress does not vanish during Ramadan. The stressors we had before are still going to be there. Sometimes, especially during the first week while we're adjusting to increased stress, that's happening from adjusting to fasting, the stress of the relationship can actually increase. So people, especially when we're not used to it, don't do well when we're hungry and when we're feeling hypoglycemic or when we're particularly tired or thirsty. We tend to be crabby. We tend to be irritable. Be honest with yourself and your spouse about your expectations of yourself, but also of what you're capable of during this time. Be mindful that the way we've been trying to deal with stress may not work right now, especially in the first few days or week. Excuse me. And this is particularly important if you and your spouse are caffeine drinkers. A week before Ramadan is a good time to start reducing that caffeine and get out of the habit of needing that every day. Because when you start the first couple days of fasting and you've got a throbbing headache from the caffeine withdrawal, that's just going to make a difficult situation even more difficult. In the past, you may have had expectations of your spouse of what's going to be cooked or how we're going to do suhoor in the morning because one person was a stay-at-home person, the other one wasn't, the other one worked outside the home, or even if both work outside the home, how we split up those things, it's very likely going to look different now. Again, everybody's responsibilities have changed. Everyone's ability to keep up with those responsibilities have changed. So it's very likely you're going to need to have a conversation about what are the expectations of each other right now. When you have marital stress, normally, under normal situations, I would always tell couples that it's most healthy to discuss these things as much as possible. Limit talking when you're angry and take breaks in the conversation if needed, but talk about the problem. What's different today is that we're together 24/7. Again, many of us don't have the normal release of going to work or going to the gym or going to our families or even going to Taraweeh or the masjid. If we're talking about situations that are going to cause significant strain, that are hot button topics, that are things that our spouse is particularly sensitive about, this may not be the right time for that. We may need to be a little bit more mindful of the current situation, whether that means we have to wait till after iftar because this is a topic that has to be covered soon if it's time sensitive, for example, or it may mean wait until after Ramadan when we're able to discuss things like that again. But being mindful of that is extremely important. Other ways of managing stress that are inshallah helpful all throughout the year, but particularly this month, dhikr, reading Quran, extra nawafil salah, especially if you have the energy for these things. I won't necessarily recommend anybody to keep up with their exercise routine. That's something that's going to be different for everyone. These are still long fasts in most of the country. So if you're not somebody who's used to walking or running or whatever your regular exercise has been, during fasting is not the time to start. If you've already been doing it, be mindful of how it's affecting you. But even then, spending some time outside, getting fresh air, being in nature can have its own benefits to help stress. If you are, mashallah, privileged enough to have a yard in your home or a balcony, or even sometimes when the weather is getting better, I know in some parts of the country it's probably already nice, but in the Midwest, we had snow 3 times this week. So it's definitely not nice everywhere. But if you're able to even open a window and sit by the window and just let fresh air in and get some sunlight, that can have mental health benefits to helping you manage stress and reduce anxiety. As well as if you're able to and you have the time to take naps if possible. Most of us really enjoy midday naps in Ramadan when we're fasting, but of course that's not possible for people who are logged in at work or have to be connected to their jobs outside the home or inside the home. Staying connected with friends and family is also very important. We're going to feel their loss more than we normally do. So being able to speak with them, being able to FaceTime or video chat with people, knowing what's going on with each other, sending gifts, sending Eid gifts, but even sending Ramadan gifts or food, those kinds of things are going to help us feel connected to them and remind them that we're here for them as well. This is also a very good time for increased charity. Most of us, mashallah, are mindful of using Ramadan and the increased barakah of this month to do more charity. But this is also something that's helpful in marital stress. I talk to couples all the time about when you're extremely concerned about something, you're particularly distressed about something, remember that sadaqah can help bring ease to your life and is going to increase the reward you get from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the best possible time of the year to be doing that. So again, yes, alhamdulillah, shaitan is locked up. Yes, mashallah, this is a very holy month and a month of significantly increased reward, but we are still human beings and we are going to very likely keep up many of the similar patterns we always have had. So marital stress is not going to necessarily go away. And for many people, it's very normal for marital stress to increase during Ramadan, especially since that also means, even under normal circumstances, that we've got increased responsibilities, whether with cooking or with socializing. So again, this year is going to look different, but marital stress may still be there. Being mindful of that is going to be a healthy way of taking care of how you manage your home and being able to take care of your family. Next slide. As was mentioned before, I just want to remind people that Khalil Center right now is offering web therapy services. We are open, we are running. All of our therapists, psychologists are offering services online right now. We actually offer that throughout the year. That's something we always offer, but currently all sessions are online. In line with the current stay-at-home orders. We also have online support groups. I know these things have been mentioned earlier today by some of our other speakers, but I'm just gonna quickly remind everybody that it's normal to have increased anxiety right now. It is normal to feel that increased stress. That is going to have an effect on your relationship. Utilizing something like therapy services or an online support group can be an excellent way of channeling some of that stress into healthy communication with your spouse or better self-care. We also offer a YouTube channel with short videos from many of us talking about ways of managing depressive symptoms, stress, being more spiritually, spiritually connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala during this month, but just in general. And as well as an online blog we have and the Khalil Center helpline. These services are only going to be possible with your extremely generous and kind donations. So please be mindful of that this month, inshallah, as well as throughout the year, for these services to be able to continue benefiting all of us, inshallah, in the community. Jazakallah khair for joining today and listening. And I'd like to open it up for the next few minutes of any questions that people may have.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Sara. That was incredibly insightful, and we appreciate your time, alhamdulillah. So we will, inshallah, go ahead and take questions. So if anybody has questions, you can go ahead and submit them to the Q&A chat box, and we can field them for the next few minutes. And in the meantime, I had a question that I wanted to ask.
Sure.
So a lot of what you discussed today involves a lot of like honest conversations with each other, and it's really clear that open communication is a huge key to making marriages work in general. So what would you advise for folks that have actually not been used to having such open, honest conversations with each other, and now are kind of pressed in the situation where that needs to happen, given the current circumstances?
So it's kind of a mixed bag because number one, like I said, I as a therapist, I definitely want to encourage people to be honest and discuss with one another what their concerns are, how they're feeling about things, what they may need from their spouse. But we do have to be mindful that right now we don't have our usual outlets and we don't have our usual way of supporting ourselves when we need to, because unfortunately the reality is some of those conversations don't go well. Sometimes we have to have difficult conversations that we know are going to be triggering or upsetting, but they have to be had. So this is a time to certainly be mindful of that, meaning that make sure that you've at least thought about how you would give yourself or your spouse some space, whether that's emotional space or physical space if possible, and also to be mindful of the limited resources anybody has access to right now. Especially when it comes to financial stressors, we may need to be having some frank conversations about money and spending. Some people have been, using online shopping as an outlet right now, way more than before. A lot of us have cut back on spending just because we're limited how much we're going. But financial problems and financial stressors are really common right now. Having these conversations from a healthy place, keeping in mind that you and your spouse are on the same team, and the only way to talk to your teammate is by supporting them and being calm and not making them feel attacked, not phrasing things in a way that makes people defensive. So being conscious of speaking about how you feel versus, so for example, like you never listen versus I don't feel heard. So owning what it is you're saying to help prevent people from feeling defensive, that kind of thing. Did that answer your question?
Yes, barakallahu fiki. Thank you.
Wayakum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is the other moderator from the Bay Area office. Thank you
Walaikum
very much.
assalam.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sara. There was a question that was earlier on during your presentation. I think it might have been missed in the chat box.
Okay.
Okay, I can just read it out for you. It
Yes,
says,
please.
thank you, Dr. Syed, for your interesting presentation. Question: what advice do you have for Muslims who have a hard time consistently honoring our duties to our spouse, i.e. being a garment for them, if they do not honor their duties to Allah? For example, they do not perform their salah or they consume alcohol?
Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon question. I actually get this a lot in the work that I do. Number one, we have to remember that our duties are, well, yes, we do have a responsibility to our spouse. All of that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning that our responsibility to fulfill our role to the best of our ability is going to be noticed and rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if your spouse is not. But if you're living in an environment that you feel is conflicted in a way that you are trying to be mindful of pleasing Allah and your spouse is consciously living in a way that's displeasing to Allah, these are bigger conversations to be had about, is this relationship sustainable? Are you happy in this relationship? Are you able to, raise your family, for example, in a way that both of you feel comfortable and is compromising? Some of the questions about how can I be, honest, or how can I be respectful of a spouse who is disobedient to God is a very legitimate question, but can't be the only one. So it requires you to be willing to explore further. If you're in this relationship with somebody who's drinking or not praying or isn't concerned with the tenets of Islam, how do you feel about that? And how is your relationship affected by that? These are also some of the things that need to be explored. The chat box had another question about if your parents are in conflict, how do you suggest you react, such as avoiding the conversation, offer support, advocate for one parent or the other, based on your knowledge? This is a tricky question when the relationship is not yours, essentially. To say that your parents' marriage doesn't affect you is not a fair or accurate statement. Even as adults, our parents' relationship affects us, but particularly if we're still living in the home with them or are younger, their interactions are going to affect our ability to feel comfortable, to feel safe, and of course going to affect us if we hear one being hurtful to the other, that kind of thing. In terms of how to react, this is going to look different for everyone. Not every relationship's conflicts are dangerous or violent or potentially harmful. In those situations, you're probably going to need outside help, whether it's with professionals or the police if need to be called, or having a trusted friend or family member intervene. But even in that situation, I would still recommend talking to the parent that you feel safe to talk to or the one that may need help. But when there's no, violence or anything like that, if we're talking about what I would call routine conflict, the kind of conflict that most of us have up and down in every marriage, your role may be limited to what your parents are willing to allow. Not every parent, not every couple is going to feel comfortable with their children, even adult children, being involved in the relationship. And that can also make people feel attacked and get defensive, particularly if they feel like the one parent is presenting in a way that's making the children side with them. I often have situations where parents will say that, like, oh, because the mom is crying, the kids will side with the mom, but they're not even hearing that of what happened or how it happened, which ultimately ends up alienating them, making them feel like they're separate from their kids, like the kids and the mom are one unit, they're a separate unit. And that's going to impact the family's ability to be healthy and to have future healthy relationships with one another. So make dua for your parents, talk to them in a level that is respectful to them, but also that you're comfortable with. But be mindful that your help has to be limited to what they're willing to accept and allow.